The Egypt most of us learned about in textbooks and museums is only part of the story, and maybe the most distorted part. For centuries, ancient Egypt was presented as a Mediterranean civilization, barely connected to the rest of the continent. The archaeological, linguistic, and cultural evidence tells a different story. Kemet, as the Egyptians themselves called their land, was African in geography and in essence, shaped from the beginning by the Black African civilizations to its south. This video looks at the African roots of Egyptian spirituality, the deep ties between Kemet and Nubia, and the cultural evidence that connects Egypt to the wider African world. Reclaiming Egypt as a Black African civilization is not only historically accurate, it is necessary if we want an honest account of world history. Stay with us as we go through what the dominant narrative left out. Global myths. Between myths and memories, another journey begins. For centuries, Eurocentric historians shaped the dominant narrative about ancient Egypt, working to disconnect it from the rest of Africa. By emphasizing supposed ties to Greece and Rome, these accounts buried the fact that Egypt was, and is, a Black African civilization. This erasure was not an accident. It served a worldview that denied African contributions to history, science, and spirituality. This whitewashing took several forms. Museums displayed Egyptian statues with broken or missing noses. Most Egyptologists attribute the damage mainly to iconoclasm, looting, and natural erosion, with some intentional mutilation of statues in antiquity linked to religious or political motives, not specifically to race. But the detail of the missing noses is often read in Afrocentric literature as deliberate racial erasure. Textbooks painted Egyptians as light-skinned, distinct from their Nubian neighbors. Films cast European actors in the roles of pharaohs and gods. None of these choices were neutral. They reflect a cultural agenda more than historical accuracy. African and diaspora researchers such as Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Ivan van Sertima, and Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, among others, spent decades dismantling these myths. Working with archaeology, linguistics, and comparative cultural studies, they rebuilt the case for the African identity of Egypt. The people of Kemet spoke a language of the Afro-Asiatic family, which includes Semitic languages such as Arabic and Hebrew, practiced a religion consistent with traditions found elsewhere on the continent, and kept constant contact with their African neighbors. African spiritual traditions that survived the transatlantic slave trade, candomblé, vodun, Ifa, carry symbols and deities with real parallels to ancient Egyptian religion. Veneration of ancestors, reverence for the elements, gods who balance opposing forces. Even after centuries of enslavement and displacement, African descendants kept fragments of that older worldview alive in ritual, in rhythm, and in reverence. This is not only an academic argument. For people of the African diaspora, reclaiming Egypt is both personal and political, a way of restoring pride in a legacy that colonialism worked hard to erase. It confronts the old idea that Africa before colonization was only tribes and suffering. Egypt shows that the continent produced civilization, innovation, and spiritual depth for thousands of years. The Afrocentric account has been gaining ground in classrooms, documentaries, and community programs that teach Egyptian history from its African roots. For Black youth, this shift means access to ancestral models and achievements that truly reflect who they are. Knowledge becomes a tool of liberation. The spiritual side matters just as much. As more people return to traditional African religions, Egypt becomes a bridge between ancient and contemporary practice. Ceremonies invoking Isis, meditations on the Eye of Horus, and renewed devotion to Ma'at are resurfacing in diaspora spirituality. Kemet is becoming sacred again, not as myth, but as something people actually practice. Pop culture shows the same pattern. Musicians and filmmakers are bringing Egyptian imagery into stories about Black resilience and excellence, from video clips inspired by temples to fashion built on pharaonic style. Egypt is once again a symbol people use to express Black pride. The work is not finished. Several academic departments still resist Afrocentric readings of Egypt, and this resistance is institutional, not just individual disagreement. funding African-led archaeological excavations, translating primary sources written by Africans, and giving African researchers more space in the conversation are concrete ways to keep moving forward. Africa's legacy is not absence. It is a record of brilliance that was there all along, waiting to be told on its own terms. Ancient Egypt called itself Kemet, the Black Land, because of the dark, fertile soil along the banks of the Nile. The name was, at once, a literal description and a mark of identity. And that identity was not isolated at all. Kemet was an African society, shaped by its people and the landscape around it, embedded in the rest of the ancient world, not separate from it. The Nile fed that land. It rises deep in the African interior and flows north, connecting Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan to the Mediterranean coast. The people who lived along its banks in Kemet shared cultural, genetic, and spiritual ties with the rest of the continent. The river worked as a route, carrying goods, ideas, and people, not only water. It allowed Egypt to grow while keeping constant contact with the rest of Africa. Religious practice and art carry traces of southern influence throughout, especially during periods of Nubian rule. Culture moved along that river as constantly as the water did. The Nile was treated as a living deity, a spiritual artery. Festivals followed the river's cycles, reinforcing the bond between people, land, and cosmos, a pattern that runs through African civilization more broadly. Western scholarship long treated Egypt as an exception, African by location, but not by culture. That view comes from colonial and Eurocentric thinking, which worked to cut African peoples off from their own legacies of achievement. It also ignored what is clearly visible in the art, language, and ritual of Kemet. Look closely, honestly, and you find a civilization tied to the rest of Africa, physically and spiritually. Original Egyptian art looks nothing like Hollywood's whitewashed version, or the version found in 19th century European museums. Royal tombs and funerary art from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms show people with clearly African features. The busts of pharaohs like Mentuhotep II, the imagery of Queen Ahmose Nefertari, and reliefs of Nubian soldiers and dancers all point to the African roots of Kemet. None of this was marginal. It was central to Egypt's visual identity. This is a different line of evidence from skin color, which followed a symbolic code tied to gender and religious context. It was common for the same person to appear painted in different tones, depending on the religious or narrative context of the scene. The sculpted shape of the face and the texture of the hair, however, came from the observation of real bodies, which makes them closer to a literal physiognomic portrait. From the royal court to common people, these features appear throughout Egyptian society and reinforce Kemet's deep roots in the African continent. Egypt was not a civilized outpost set against a primitive Africa around it. It was one of the founding civilizations of the continent. From its earliest days, Egypt was tied to Nubia, especially to the kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan. These southern neighbors traded with Egypt, formed alliances with it, and at times ruled it directly. Even the earliest Egyptian dynasties show Nubian influence in language, symbols, and governance. The 25th dynasty, known as the Kushite dynasty, is one of the clearest examples of Kemet's Black African legacy. Rulers such as Piye, Shabaka, and Taharqa came from Nubia and saw themselves as restorers of Egyptian tradition, not as foreign conquerors. They rebuilt temples, revived the cult of Amun, and reaffirmed Ma'at as the guiding principle of Egypt's government. These rulers committed themselves to Egypt's cultural and spiritual continuity. They studied Egyptian texts, respected the wisdom of earlier dynasties, and supported priesthoods and temple life. Their rule worked as a bridge between Nubia in the south and Egypt in the north, united by shared cosmology and values. This is African unity, not as an idea, but as something that actually happened. Beyond politics, spiritual practice across Africa closely aligns with what we see in Egypt. Ancestor veneration sits at the center of African spirituality more broadly, and Kemet honored its ancestors the same way, with offerings, names inscribed in tombs, and rituals to guide their journey into the afterlife. Akan, Yoruba, and Bakongo traditions follow the same logic. The dead remain active members of the community. Egyptian solar theology, the cult of Ra and later of Aten, connects to a wider African reverence for the sun as the source of life. The sun's daily death and rebirth mirror how many African traditions understand cyclical time, rebirth, and cosmic balance, with the sun standing at the physical and spiritual center at once. Egypt's architecture, its stone temples, pyramids, and tombs, carries spiritual weight alongside artistic ambition. These structures were aligned with celestial bodies and built around symbolic geometry. A similar level of astronomical knowledge appears at Nabta Playa, a megalithic site in the desert of southern Egypt, near the Sudanese border, whose stone circle predates Stonehenge by roughly 2,000 years. Egypt's art, language, and religious practice were not static. They evolved through contact with other African cultures, carried along trade routes, marriages, and pilgrimages that linked Kemet to the African interior. Incense, gold, ivory, and exotic animals traveled north. Ideas and spiritual symbols traveled south. This exchange shaped Egyptian civilization continuously, not only at its founding. According to some Eurocentric scholars, the colors in Egyptian painting form a coded symbolic system. Men usually appear in red ochre, women in yellow, and this difference represents social and gender role, not actual phenotype. It was common for the same person to appear painted in different tones, depending on the religious or narrative context. Black also carries its own symbolic weight, separate from ethnicity. Osiris, god of death and resurrection, is commonly shown with black or green skin, colors tied to the fertility of the dark silt deposited by the Nile and the promise of rebirth in the afterlife. The same logic appears in funerary coffins painted black during the late period, a color associated with safe passage to the realm of the dead. But that is death theology, not a document of racial identity. This does not weaken the case for Egypt as an African civilization, it just shifts where that case actually rests. The strongest evidence is not in the paint on the wall, it is in the convergence between archaeology, material culture shared with Nubia and African geography, and Kush, as we saw in the previous chapter. Ancient DNA studies are also part of this conversation, but they cover only a handful of sites and specific periods within nearly 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty remain the most concrete and least contested example of direct Black African leadership over Kemet. From the elite to common people, Egypt's population resembled the continent it was part of. Some figures wear hairstyles and clothing similar to those still found today among the Maasai, the Yoruba, and the Dinka. Egypt's own historical record, in hieroglyphs and oral tradition, speaks often of alliances, marriages, and conflicts with neighbors on the African continent itself. Its spiritual philosophy and moral codes grew out of a broader African worldview, built around harmony with nature, respect for ancestors, and the cycle of life and death. This worldview shaped Kemetic society from the ground up and runs through its temples, pyramids, and sacred texts. In the 25th dynasty, Kushite pharaohs took power and restored Egypt's oldest religious traditions. These rulers, often called the Black Pharaohs, rebuilt temples and revived Kemetic religion, championing African unity and spiritual renewal. They were not outsiders conquering foreign territory. They were Africans reclaiming a heritage that was already theirs. Their rule stands as a reminder that Egypt and Nubia grew from the same root. Today, there is a growing movement to tell Egypt's story as part of Africa again. Researchers, artists, and spiritual leaders are reclaiming it as part of the continent's cultural and historical continuum. Reading the temples of Luxor and Karnak, the writings of Ptahhotep and Imhotep, and the rituals around Isis and Osiris through an African lens. This work matters for repairing what was erased. Seeing Egypt as African is not revisionism, it is accuracy. And that accuracy can rebuild pride, unity, and a clearer view of Africa's role in shaping human civilization. The names of the gods and goddesses we know today, Isis, Horus, Osiris, Anubis, are not the original names of these deities. They are Greek names, imposed centuries later after the Hellenistic conquest of Kemet, the land its own people called the Black Land. The native names survived in the hieroglyphs and the oldest texts. Isis is Aset, Horus is Heru, Osiris is Weezer, Anubis is Inpu. This substitution of names was not a minor linguistic detail. It erased the original voice of an African people and covered it with a foreign lens, the same lens that for centuries tried to tear ancient Egypt away from the rest of the African continent. Recovering these names is part of the same project of recovering Kemet's African identity. And that is why, from here on, we will use the original terms whenever possible. Egypt's gods and goddesses were not distant or abstract. They were nature itself, personified, embodying the forces that shaped the world. This is a deeply African way of seeing things, with no real line between the divine and the natural. A storm is not just weather, it is the presence of a god. Each Egyptian deity represented some essential part of life, building a kind of spiritual ecology rooted in everyday experience. Aset, known in the West Isis, embodied motherhood, magic, healing, and protection. She was not simply worshipped from a distance. She was a presence people turned to, watching over families, children, and the sick. Maternal figures and female spirits hold comparable roles in many African societies as protectors and healers. Aset's imagery closely aligns with the ancestral mothers venerated across the continent. Weser, known as Osiris, governed agriculture, rebirth, and the afterlife. His death and resurrection mirror nature's own cycle, especially the Nile's yearly flood and recession, which renewed Egypt's farmland every year. Like many African agricultural deities, Weser holds life and death at once, buried like a seed, only to be reborn as harvest and renewal. Heru, known as Horus, the falcon-headed god, represented kingship, vision, and the ongoing struggle between light and darkness. His conflict with Set, the god of chaos, represents the theme of order triumphing over disorder, something that repeats throughout African mythology more broadly. Heru's kingship also mirrors how leadership worked in many African traditions, where rulers acted as spiritual mediators responsible for maintaining balance and justice. Inpu, known as Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, guided souls into the afterlife. This role corresponds to how animal spirits function in many African traditions, where certain animals serve as totems or messengers between worlds. The jackal itself, a scavenger that moves by night, fits naturally into that space between life and death. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and healing, carries that same fierce restorative energy found in warrior spirits and African orishas. She was at once destroyer and protector, feared and respected in equal measure. Yoruba orishas, like Oya and Ogun, hold equally complex roles, carrying destructive power alongside sacred purpose. Sekhmet's duality fits the same broader African understanding of chaos balanced by harmony. Every god in the Egyptian pantheon mattered beyond myth. They were woven into daily life through rituals, festivals, and community practices. People invoked Bastet to protect their homes, Jehuti, known as Thoth, to bless their studies, Hathor to bring joy and fertility. This is a religiosity built around communal well-being and personal guidance, not distant worship or abstract dogma, and it is the same pattern found in African religious practice more broadly. Like other African traditions, Egyptian spirituality centered on balance. The gods did not act at random. They answered to Ma'at, the cosmic order and moral code. Ma'at was not a deity in the traditional sense. It was a principle running through the universe, linking gods and humans. These gods were often shown part human, part animal, treating both as sacred. African masks, totems, and sculptures follow the same logic, giving spirits and ancestors hybrid features to show their connection to animals and the forces of nature. In this visual language, animals are not lesser beings. They are sacred expressions of life in their own right. The gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt were not confined to temples or myths. They worked as living symbols of African thought, a culture that found divinity in the wind and the flame, in the lion and the river, in the sun and the soil. Their stories continue, not only in the hieroglyphs, but in African spiritual traditions still practiced today, which honor nature, the ancestors, and the connections between all forms of life. Egyptian creation stories begin with water, a theme found in African traditions across the continent. Nun, the dark and boundless waters of chaos, is the source from which everything comes. From Nun comes Atum, the self-created god who gives rise to the first divine pair and sets cosmic order in motion. Similar ideas run through African cosmologies more broadly, where water is treated as the origin of life and the medium through which divine will manifests. In Yoruba tradition, the supreme god Olodumare sends Obatala to create solid ground out of the watery abyss. In Dogon tradition, from Mali, the world also emerges from watery chaos through the work of spiritual beings. These traditions are culturally distinct, but they share the same basic idea: water as the origin of everything, older than the earth itself. Egypt's creation story fits that same structure. There is something worth noting in how this universe is born, not through violence, but through emergence. Many other ancient mythologies have creation arise out of a battle or a dismemberment. African cosmogonies, by contrast, tend to portray creation as something that unfolds peacefully. Atum's act of creation is quiet, almost intimate, a breath, a word spoken into the void. That gentleness says something about a worldview in which life is treated as sacred and connected from the start. Egypt's first temples were built to honor these sacred waters. Sanctuaries near the Nile represented Nun, and ritual baths echoed the waters of creation. Priests purified themselves in these basins before ceremonies, reenacting that same movement from chaos to order. These were not merely symbolic gestures. They were spiritual practices grounded in a reverence for water shared across the continent. This creation story also shaped how people were meant to live. Just as Atum brought order to the universe, humans were meant to uphold Mat, the principle of balance, justice, and truth. Similar ideas appear throughout Africa. Ubuntu, in southern Africa, built around human interconnection, or the Akan concept of Nyame Nti, trust in divine harmony. Egypt's creation story worked at once as an origin myth and as a guide for living. Coffin texts describe creation in poetic language, blending myth with ritual instruction. Reciting them was treated as a way of directly taking part in the cosmic cycle, the same way griot storytelling functions as performance and transformation, not just narration. In many African societies, the land itself counts as a living being, born of divine waters and kept alive by human care. The land is honored, not owned. Egypt held the same belief. The Nile's seasonal cycles set the rhythm of agriculture, festivals, and even temple construction. The natural world was not separate from the divine. It was the divine. These parallels between African cosmogonies point to a shared ancestral knowledge, carried and adapted over thousands of years. Egypt was not borrowing from the rest of Africa. It grew from the same spiritual soil. The coincidence is not a coincidence. It is evidence of just how connected these cultures really were. For those watching this video from the diaspora, this means one direct thing. Heru, Aset, and Wesir do not belong to a European museum. They are part of a spiritual lineage that crossed the Atlantic, survived enslavement, and is still alive in practices, symbols, and names that many people carry without knowing their origin. Relearning Kemet means relearning a part of yourself that was deliberately erased. Recognizing Kemet as part of Black Africa is not a gesture of historical reconciliation. It is a correction of authorship. For centuries, Egypt's history was told by people with an interest in separating it from the rest of the continent, and that separation served a specific project, proving that African greatness needed an exception in order to exist. It did not. This correction has practical consequences. It changes what goes into textbooks, what museums put on exhibit labels, and who gets invited to speak about Kemetic gods with authority. It is not enough to say Egypt is African and keep treating the rest of the continent as background scenery. The same research, the same rigor, and the same respect given to Kemet need to apply to Kush, to the Sahelian empires, to the kingdoms of Central and Southern Africa. This is not nostalgia, it is work. There is an Akan name for this movement, Sankofa, going back to retrieve what was left behind before moving forward. And the next step in this work is simple. Keep asking who else was erased, and tell that story too. Global myths. Between myths and memories, another journey begins. Thank you for joining this journey until the end. If you enjoy myths, legends, and stories that have traveled across centuries, explore the playlists and other videos on the channel. Many more fascinating narratives are waiting for you. And tell us in the comments, which myth or legend would you like to see in the next video?